Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Amanda. Where to from here? I think the critical question that always annoys me when I hit budgets is whether they're really that important or not. And as an economist, I will tell you openly, budgets are way more a political statement than they are ever an economic statement. And so this, you've got in front of you an economist talking to you, making commentary about a political statement, which is a bit scary. So I do need to put my prejudices in front of you so you know where I'm coming from. As an economist and as a business person, I put myself on the progressive wing of thought, and by progressive I mean I am one of the economists that acknowledges the failure of markets to function. They have not delivered, and when I learnt my economics a good few decades ago, I was taught about how markets don't function and how governments have a role to play. That is not what is taught now, but I still hold to that in terms of my economic beliefs. So I'm on the progressive wing of thought, but having said that, because I've got to make a political statement, essentially, I won't tell you who I have voted for in the past, but I did not vote for this government, and I haven't voted for any of the major political parties in the New Zealand spectrum for quite a long time. So I'll leave you to do that, to figure out where I do sit. The political imperative, and I'll go to the go back to Nick's economic context in a second, but the political imperative out there, from my perspective, is that we were promised a government of change and we were promised a government of transformation. And the big question is whether this government uses the age-old excuse of we can't afford it to postpone that change and that transformation, which in my opinion is long overdue from an economic perspective, let alone all those other dimensions. Why this announcement next week is even more important from a political perspective is the last few months have seen what I would see as many issues that have signalled things going on the back burner in terms of transformation or in terms of change. Whether you talk about things that have been put off the agenda or talk about things that have been delayed, deferred, or put on the shelf. Whether it be capital gains tax, whether it be issues around Kiwi Build, whether there's the teachers' pay strike, pay or issue and or strike, the response to the welfare group report, and I was on that group, so I won't talk too much about that, but it goes in this context. The zero carbon bill, not quite as transformative as some would hope, but reasonably, I will acknowledge there's been huge steps forward in some of these issues, but not quite as much as we were promised. And then similarly, cannabis referendum. Again, a few, I suppose, concerns about just how far forward transformationally this government is going to go. So I think this next week's announcements is almost the last throw of the dice in terms of this government about whether the next 18 months is going to be transformational as promised or whether it's going to be more a business as usual. So are we really going to see a wellbeing budget, or is it going to be a business as usual with a glossy cover? And I think that's the issue and that's what I'll be looking at. The understanding of well-being is, dare I say, a little bit muddled. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a fan of the Treasury version of well-being or the Treasury perspective on well-being. I will be honest in saying I applaud their ability to now spell the word, which is a huge step forward. I will applaud their acknowledgement that we're now allowed to use that word in economic documents, which is also a huge step forward, but there's a long way to go. From the economic perspective, yes, the outlook is grim, and yes, it's coming from offshore, but the outlook's always been grim for New Zealand. basically from the reason why the budget is even more important next week is because of the current situation in the economic cycle. I won't get too technical, but the last 30 odd years we have been told that monetary policy, that is interest rates going up or down, is the way we control or manage an economy. Well, the last 5 years should tell economists, let alone everybody else, that monetary policy is now redundant. It's actually impotent now. We've got monetary policy, we've got the official cash rate at the lowest it can possibly be, well, fairly close to, 1.5%, which effectively is pretty close to zero here in New Zealand, and around the world it is zero in some parts. So monetary policy is now, despite the textbook that most of us and most economists current day learnt, is now not useful anymore in terms of managing the cycle. If we've got a whole lot of shocks, what economists call shocks, hitting the economy, then there's one other tool left in the basket. It's called fiscal policy. And for those who don't know what fiscal policy means, it's basically government taxing and spending. That's fiscal policy. The last 30 years we were told governments didn't have a role to play. Well, now it does. Okay? And that's, in my mind, the critical, you put that issue, fiscal policy is way more important than monetary policy. So let's stop knee-jerk response, headline every 3 months the Reserve Bank makes an announcement about the interest rate, because they have to make an announcement about the interest rate every 6 weeks actually, which is a bit scary because it's not that important anymore. What's way more important is what government is going to do in terms of its taxing and its spending for the economic cycle. Because monetary policy is now redundant. We've only got one tool back. We've actually got to bring back fiscal policy into the jargon of New Zealand economic management, which is going to be a bit scary for some of those economists who have been taught that government doesn't have a role to play. You know, it's only the markets that function. My worry, and indeed it's almost reflected in the response we had last week to the transport package, the Wellington transport package that was announced, and I sort of yawned a bit because we were promised this a little while ago, but lo and behold, we had headlines which say Treasury advised against that because the business case hadn't been worked out, hadn't been issued in terms of this transport infrastructure spend. My response is, if we'd waited for the business case, we probably still wouldn't have built the Auckland Harbour Bridge. And I'm only semi-joking there. So how much effort do we have to do in terms of convincing people that a business case is actually very narrow? Let's do the bleeding obvious. Sometimes it does take, and that's leadership, that's fiscal policy, that's government. Hand on heart, the country needs the spending, go out and do it. What was that? What was that election? Never mind. You know, I recall 3 words, but I can't quite remember them. Anyway, if you want to know how scary it is out there in the world at the moment, is that quote from the IMF, which I'll just put in front of you. The main shared policy priority is for countries to resolve cooperatively and quickly their trade disagreements and resulting policy uncertainty, which is the IMF code for saying, please, Mr. President Trump and Mr. President of everything else, fix it and stop getting ourselves into a mess, because there's sorts of things that are really quite scary when the 2 biggest economies in the world don't want to trade with each other. New Zealand's going to get hurt, not to mention a fair lot of other people. But that's the context. There's always been an excuse not to deliver. But this government's got to deliver next week. Putting aside all of those other issues, yes, I know this current minister likes to talk about a rainy day surplus. I'll go into the issues around the surplus in a second. But in my mind, a rainy day surplus is hopeless when a fair number of our people are already drowning. So that rainy day surplus excuse is wearing a bit thin in my mind. There's the story about fiscal policy is now critical. What's that a picture of? That's a picture of the interest rate at which the government can borrow. The New Zealand government can borrow. And it's heading down. When the New Zealand government can borrow at what is not much more than 2% per annum, I begin to question why we really are that worried about debt in this country. We were promised transformation. Actually, the government's hoisted itself up on its own pedestal because it hasn't done anything to reduce our expectations about transformation. So I hold them to account. The Wellbeing Budget, can we afford it? Bluntly, there's a graph of the surplus projected in December last year in the budget policy statement and the half-year economic and fiscal update. And these documents are great. I know most people start at the front of documents. Whenever I get this document, I always go to the back because that's where all the important stuff is, okay? The numbers. And one of those numbers is graphed out there. You've got the government increasing its surplus over the next 3-4 years to a surplus of pretty close to $8 billion annual in the last year of that horizon. And that includes about $2.5 billion of new spend per year included in that forecast. Okay, so we've got in the kitty already $2.5 billion of new spend every year. And so there'll be some announcements already, and indeed on the 30th of May, which will tell you how much of that $2.5 billion will be spent. But actually, that's going to give you $8 billion surplus. So how much more can we do? Well, this scenario here gives you another $500 million a year. So that gives you $3 billion every year to do new stuff. Okay, let alone the stuff that we're already doing. And that still, to me, looks like a surplus. Okay, that's still, $4.5 billion. So it's not really, we still got that rainy day surplus. And actually, if you want to push the envelope even further, we could even go, $3 billion surplus every year. That's still quite a lot in the New Zealand context. That gives you $3.5 billion new spend per year. And I know there's a whole lot of queues for spending, but that's quite a lot of elbow room. And even with that, a whole lot of numbers, sorry, but it's important, even with that, there is not a problem with debt. Even with my optimistic $3.5 billion new spend every year for the next 3 or 4 years, that's a picture of the debt that everybody worries about. The blue line is what the Treasury are forecasting, okay, which is down to 17.5% of GDP. The target is 20%. We've hit that target already, so why are we worried about it? My scenario, when you have $3.5 billion new spend every year, you still hit your 20% target by 2022-23, which is actually not that far out. And I'll put this in context. This doesn't include the $40 billion that we've got squirreled away in the super fund. Okay? You add that onto this, and our debt is actually, or not our debt, the government's debt is actually pretty close to zero. Okay? The top of that graph only gets to 23% of GDP. This is low by New Zealand historical standards. It is low by international standards. Debt in Germany, government debt in Germany, actually in other parts of the world, Australia even, that number is well over 50% of GDP. It's off that scale, okay? So why, oh why do New Zealand economic and business commentators consistently point to this as an important number. Why, oh why has this allegedly transformational government buyed that argument, buyed that narrative, and tied themselves into a target of something that is actually economically meaningless? And actually, let's push it out a little bit of elbow room, and this is the issue, or this is the number that I'll be looking at when I look at the numbers, is just how much elbow room will this government use to push that target out just a little bit. Use some, for want of a better word, creative accounting if it really has to. It's met its own self-imposed responsibility rules already. Its responsibility rules was where the dot was. It's met them already by the blue line going under that dot. Okay? So it could actually just say, well, we've met the debt targets, now we're going to go spend because we have to. Why do we have to spend? I'll skip that slide, I'll need some. Why do we have to spend? The business case for transformation. Somebody earlier asked me something about the ageing population and superannuation problems. Somebody else asked me about capital gains tax. To me, those are side issues. We in New Zealand have a habit of worrying about stuff that really, really isn't that important, like government debt. I remember when I went to university, which was a few years ago, pretty close to 40 years ago now, 4 decades, was when I first heard the phrase climate change. And the esteemed professor at the time says, you know, it's going to be a problem, but we don't have to worry about it because we've probably got about 4 or 5 decades to adjust and transition and transform and get used to it and figure out how we're going to respond. Okay? Well, we've used up 4 of those 5 decades. We've probably used up 4.5 of those 5 decades already. It's about time we started transitioning seriously, rather than getting in the queue and pleading a special case about how we can't transition and it's got to be somebody else that does it for us. Climate change, inequality. Amanda talked about social capital and how embedded inequalities mean that trust in our institutions, the trust in our ability to contribute, our licence to operate as a business gets eroded away if embedded inequalities remain. That's what economics is about. It's not about budget responsibility rules, and it's not about finance. When we talk about we can't afford to address inequality, I say, can we afford not to? From an economic perspective. Economics is about the people and about the communities, and it's about those well-beings. The third one, climate change, inequality. The third one, and it's related to inequality, is housing. If there aren't seriously large dollars on housing in this budget, around $2 billion a year in terms of Kiwi Build, I will admit, not a year, $2 billion kickstart for Kiwi Build is a big number, but it's going to take time. We're running out of time. I've got a couple of other slides I do want to talk about. No, I won't talk about that. We're talking about climate change. That's my inequality argument. I'll leave it. I've got one more slide on this. This is the elephant in the room in New Zealand. People talk about inequality as somewhere far away. Amanda put up some charts about that spider chart about Māori outcomes and Pacifica outcomes compared to the rest of the population. It is a burning platform for New Zealand. We ignore it at our peril. The graph there is a graph across the horizontal axis of the proportion of households. On the vertical axis is the proportion of income or wealth that those households have. If we were reasonably close to equal as a society community, it would be a diagonal line, 45 degrees. The further away from that diagonal line you get, the further away from relative equality we get. The dashed line is the distribution of income in New Zealand, which some people like to talk about. I talk about that solid line, which is a distribution of wealth in New Zealand today. And if you look at it closely, you've got about, I think, about 90-odd% of New Zealand owning 50% of their wealth, of the country's wealth. Turn that round the other way. You've got the top 10%, which includes me, hand up, owning half the country in terms of the wealth, and most of it's the housing. The problem with wealth is that that then embeds in future opportunities for next generations. If you're talking about burning platforms, you're talking about transformation. If we're going to be serious about transformation, people like me have got to hurt. All right? It's as simple as that. I don't want to be too offensive, but it may well be a fair few of this people in this room as well. That's what we've got to confront. I'll leave that with you, and thank you for your time here. Thank you for the Policy Observatory and for Julianne helping us put this together. I'll ask Nick and Amanda to come and join us, and happy to open it up for a bit of a Q&A or just a little bit of a kōrero. There's a roving mic if anybody wants to talk or disagree with anything and everything I've said, which is fine. More than happy. I'll leave it with you. Thank you.
Ganesh, Sarah Trotman, you sidestepped talking about the welfare expert advisory group, so maybe your colleagues could comment a bit on what we would like to see in the budget with a particular focus on addressing child poverty.
Do you want to say anything, or you say something and I'm happy to jump in.
Well, there were a considerable number of recommendations that weren't followed through on. I'm aware that they're apparently looking at them, but there's a large number of those recommendations, including the increase in the basic allowance for living, that weren't followed up on at all.
I haven't been gagged on this, so I'm quite happy to talk about it. I just don't want to... Whoops. Oh, that's outside. I will acknowledge the government has signalled that they are looking at many of the recommendations, and yes, and I have got fingers crossed about some further announcements in the budget, but I'm probably not as optimistic as others on the group. My concern is when they start using the terms around building a case or a business case for those further recommendations. And I saw that, well, actually, we wrote the report, we've already given you the business case. I don't expect all of them or all of the dollars to be spent at once. But bluntly, if income adequacy, which is effectively raising the income of people at the lower end of the spectrum, is not addressed fairly quickly, this government is at serious risk of missing its intermediate child poverty targets, which is we're in the first 3 years. And yeah, bluntly, because the survey won't be run, and without being too technical, the survey to measure child poverty will be run this time next year. So the first report back will be what happens between now and this time next year, and if we haven't lifted incomes about now, it won't go through, and you won't see any change in those child poverty measures. And so those, from a strictly targeting perspective, this government risks missing those intermediate short-term child poverty targets, which leaves it open to criticism, but actually forget about the targets. I'm obviously disappointed, but and I don't think they've got the urgency of it, and that's the worry. Announcements in the budget, I think, probably will be around the housing area, which probably could well be tied to some of the recommendations in the welfare group. Undoubtedly, spending around mental health and well-being, again, that can be tied to some of the recommendations in the welfare group, but also tied to some other recommendations in some of the other reports that have been coming through. The whole thing is tied together, though. So, but I think the issue is that sense of urgency isn't quite there.
Susan St John. You talked about the New Zealand Super Fund and the offset that you would see would be appropriate so that we're measuring net debt properly, and I totally agree with that. You also showed the generation of surpluses, but you didn't talk about the use of those surpluses. The government is putting $1 billion a year from those surpluses into the New Zealand Super Fund. That's coming out of working people's taxes that could be used to put out some of the social fires that are burning. Why is this never discussed?
Good question. Agreed entirely. To be honest, without getting too technical, it's a bit of an accounting trick. I don't mind the government putting $1 billion into the super fund, but I really wish we'd get past this Chicago Business School mindset of we don't trust government with dollars, so we make sure that they're at triple arm's length from government, so we give it to this other agency who is going to spend it wisely. You're building up a nest egg in the New Zealand Super Fund. Why is the government not using that nest egg to invest in the infrastructure and or to invest in climate change transition and or welfare income support, supplements, call it what you like. I don't have a problem with putting into that fund, but that fund is available and it should be available for New Zealanders, whether it's government or other agencies. Similarly, you've got the crazy thing around Housing Corp borrowing at higher than the government could borrow to fund its expenditure on housing. It just doesn't make any sense, but it's again that mindset that we can't trust government, so we've got to put as many constraints on government as possible and let other agencies do it, because other agencies, market-driven, are supposed to be able to do it a lot more cleverer than government will. That doesn't fit with my... It doesn't fit with my model, because that other agencies or those other market-driven agencies are inevitably short-term oriented and effectively driven by financial imperatives rather than the imperative of why we have a government, which is around whether you call it well-being or essentially the future of a country. In my olden days we called it nation building, but I don't think that's in the jargon anymore.
Kia ora, Ganesh, thank you very much. As you know, my interest lies in health, so just interested in your how you see the wellbeing budget grasping that, and considering, you know, obviously mental health and addiction has got a huge priority. We've had lots of promises, not just from this government, but government before and the government before that. So now what we've got after about 15 years, close to 20, is a health system in freefall. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah. Health is another one of those ones where, again, we couldn't trust government, so we set up these nominally market-based agencies or institutions and effectively wanted them to operate in a market mechanism to mimic the market. Doesn't work. You've got DHBs that are effectively their measure of they are measured in terms of their success based on their balance sheet and their P&L, based on financial indicators, when in my mind a health system should be, the performance of a health system should be based on the health of the community that it's servicing. How do we turn that round without wiping the slate clean and starting over again? It's a big ask. I'm not expecting that to happen, but, and others more expert than myself have asked, why do we need so many DHBs in this country? Similarly, why do we need so many polytechs, and why do we need so many of these other agencies, all driven by these financial performance targets? So there's got to be dollars, and there's going to be a lot of dollars spent. My suspicion is the dollars will be on the capital side, will be on the infrastructure, so the bricks and mortar, because that's what's visible. But as you well know, a lot of the stuff around health is around the people, and similarly in the education sector, it's around the people, it's around skills and those sorts of things, training, investment in the tech required cannot be done quickly and cannot be done cheaply. So it's a big ask to expect one government to turn around and some people point to the last 9 years, some people point to the last 20 years. It's been quite a lot longer than that. I'll just, in terms of, and I'm being really, really hard on this government, but in terms of budgets, I've been through quite a lot. And I know, just looking at the age in the rooms, I think some of you probably may have lived through some budgets. How many of you remember any budget? Anything that really stands out? You might have remembered the mother of all budgets. Yeah, 1990. Well, I'll tell you, that's in terms of transformation. You might have remembered the 1984 budget. That's my, and probably the 1990 budget. That's my barometer of transformation. If you're seriously going to turn around an economy and a business model that is wedded to the market mechanism, that believes the market will work, and all we have to do is tinker at the edges and get the right incentives. So as long as we've got the right incentives for DHB or to teachers or whatever, then everything will be fine. Well, actually, when are we actually going to understand that model doesn't work? It works for some people, it works for some sectors, but in other sectors it is fundamentally broken. And that's where we've got to think about, are we going to have a budget that we're really going to remember in 30 years' time as this being the transformational one? Question mark.
Thank you. Vincent Vijay Singer from the Salvation Army Policy Unit. But I asked this question in my own behalf rather than on behalf of the Policy Unit. Very useful presentation, but while you were presenting, and your colleagues as well, thank you for your presentations, I kept thinking that politics doesn't happen in a vacuum. The flip side of politics is the media. And when we look at, for example, the capital gains tax debate, I asked myself whether a transformation budget or a critique that you have provided is justified because while economists and maybe even policy analysts work behind a desk, politics has to take account of what the people say. And my limited understanding of left-wing and right-wing governments and how the media treats them is that for generations, there's often been the discourse that left-wing governments are profligate in terms of spending, in terms of racking up the debt. In fact, that's not true if you look at figures. Conservative governments tend to be far more profligate and debt-ridden. So I understand Grant Robertson's need to be so parsimonious, because they go into the next elections and say, look, we've saved a lot of money, contrary to what our right-wing enemies would say. We are not profligate. What would an economist say, given the fact that governments have to behave or act within the discourse rather than contrary to the discourse?
It's again, that's, I'm an economist, and despite my speech or my presentation, I'm not a political analyst, but I will use the word leadership. Yes, governments have to operate within the discourse, but governments also have a very privileged platform on which to use to actually lead that discourse. And I think that's probably, and I'll be honest, those on, and I wouldn't use left or right wing, I think those on the progressive wing do hold their own governments to a lot stronger and stricter standards than others. And that's one of the, I suppose, that's one of the issues that's confronting this government is probably saying, well, actually, we did deliver quite a lot. Why aren't we getting the plaudits for it? And acknowledge that there have been significant transformation. Well, I wouldn't call them transformation, but significant changes, like obviously the families package, which did switch what was going to be a tax cut into spending. So we'll acknowledge those. And yes, there is the just transition program and those sorts of things. The capital gains tax, I'll just put to one side. It was a bit of a, But I think that was, the reflection is whether the progressive thinkers or leaders, and it's not just political, that's business and community as well as political, are actually going to be less apologetic about calling for government intervention, because that's always been a little bit of almost a third rail in terms of politics in the last 35, 40 years. Because we've hurled politically that the market is the best. The economics is always front and centre, but it's not actually real economics, it's financial economics, which is front and centre. It's been a total, capture by a certain part of the population in terms of writing the discourse and writing the narrative and the vocabulary we use. We use economic impact and we use business case when we're really only talking about dollars and cents. Well, that's not business case and that's not economic impact. That's literally financial impact. Financial case. When are we going to use about the economic impact? The economic impact is the impact on future opportunities, the impact on future generations. That was my textbook in terms of economics. It was resource allocation. One of the biggest resources New Zealand ever had was our land and our water. The sun shone and the rain fell. That was our economic resource. When we jeopardise those, we're in trouble. Well, ho-hum, 40 years later, the rain still falls, but not any more predictably, and the sun shines most of the times, but we're not quite sure when. Seriously, if we were economic policy analysts and we knew that the climate wasn't as predictable as it used to be, we should have been ready for this, because our lives literally relied on it. But we got sidetracked into the financial markets. So as long as the government finances were fine, we thought we were okay. So we measure performance based on a peculiar indicator, a financial surplus of the government. It's not actually even a government surplus. It's not even a nation surplus. It's a financial surplus. And one presentation I remember, and it was about 10 years ago, coming out of the GFC, and it was a head of a government agency, said through the 1990s, we swapped a financial deficit for a social deficit. Somehow so we got a financial surplus but a social deficit. Somehow as a community, as a government, as a nation, we prioritised financial over social. Go figure. It's the discourse. Where are our leaders? Not just political. It's community, and it's all of us in this room, dare I say. supposed to call it quits at 9, but quite happy we'll stick around for a bit longer, but quite happy to call it quits here. Thank you for your time and thank you for attending. And Nadine was going to do a quick wrap-up, and we'll stick around. There might be some coffee still left.
Just very quickly, on behalf of Berl, the Policy Observatory and AUT, thank you for attending today. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentations and got something from the discussion today. Do want to just let you know the Berl team here is at the budget lock-up next week, and that afternoon we will be putting some analysis, thoughts, feedback, etc. on our website, so do check that out. The latest Berl forecast, Bird's Eye View, is currently on the website, so do check that out as well. And if you want to receive any kind of newsletters or updates, then sign up on our website. Thank you all for coming.